There's a lot of buzzwords we see like going around on Instagram, Twitter, etc., like narcissism, narcissist. What's the other ones?
Depression,
Depression, anxiety,
imposter
toxicity,
syndrome.
imposter syndrome, all these things. Like, what is your take? Because obviously these are things that usually are actually diagnosed in the hospital. Like, you go through assessments, but now everyone's calling everyone a narcissist. Like,
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
So for me, at first, like, kind of appreciate. So before, a couple of years ago, we just didn't really talk about mental health. It was such a taboo. You wouldn't dare mention things like depression, anxiety in church. So
Yeah.
on one end, it's good that people are more like accepting, or not accepting, there's more awareness, and people are understanding, like, these things are like real and things that people are going through, and people feel more comfortable to talk about it. But I do think people have taken it too far. Like you said, something that requires a clinical diagnosis. Like, you need to actually, a psychiatrist has to diagnose you with these things, but now everybody and their mate wants to be diagnosing people with like narcissism. And I get it, like, you can identify narcissistic traits in someone, but that doesn't mean
They're
that
narcissist,
they're
I think there's multiple things that they have to have at the same time
Yeah.
for it to be narcissist.
Well, yeah, because even with things like depression, I can have symptoms of depression, but that doesn't mean, if I was to go for an assessment with my GP, that doesn't mean I'm going to meet the threshold for diagnosis of depression. So there's the experience of it and the symptoms compared to the actual disorder. And I think, yeah, people have gotten carried away with just labeling. Like, you don't like someone, or maybe, yeah, they're, manipulative, they're whatever, and then now you've diagnosed them. Well, you haven't diagnosed them, but you're calling them something that actually requires a genuine diagnosis.
Yeah, it's
So
pretty big.
So
Yeah.
with, like, for example, the term depression,
Mm-hmm.
how do we kind of distinguish or discern the difference between someone who's having a really bad day to someone who's actually depressed medically?
Yeah.
What is the kind of, like, the barriers, or not barriers? What's the parameter where you actually shifted?
Yeah. So, like, when I would assess people, so I used to work in a university as a wellbeing advisor, and people who said, I feel depressed and things like that, they will come in and we would assess them. And you have a proper, like, form where you have to ask a number of questions, but usually you're asking someone, over the last 2 weeks, how often, for example, have you felt suicidal, or how often have you felt, hopelessness? If the person answers that they've felt that way nearly every day over a long period of time, then that's probably a sign that, okay, this person isn't just having a bad day. But if it's like a couple of days and you're feeling bad, then that's probably not depression. Depression is usually, it's been happening over a long period of time, and it is pretty much daily over a long period of time. So, like, that's the difference.
So how would you kind of counsel someone who doesn't meet that depression clinical position, but they still feel bad about where they're at? Like, what sort of advice or
Yeah. So,
how do you
like,
treat?
you would do things like, well, you're identifying, like, what is the, like, cause, what is the root, and then there'll just be, like, some practical things that you can suggest the person to do depending on what it is. If that person is constantly, like, ruminating on negative things, you can simple things like, keeping a gratitude diary for a week. Those are really practical things that can help take you out of a space of low mood. But when you go into the more deeper side of it, that's where things like medication and stuff like that might come into the conversation. But yeah, on a more lower level, there are just like practical things you can do.